Across the continent, extreme weather caused by climate change is upending people's lives, forcing them to flee their homes and pushing millions into hunger and starvation. There are grim new figures from the World Meteorological Organization. They say Africa is warming faster than any other place in the world, and with that, agricultural productivity is declining. The rise in sea levels is increasing along the African coastline at a higher rate than the global average, threatening low-lying coastal cities. And extreme weather events like floods and droughts are increasing in frequency and in intensity, killing thousands of people. Large swathes of Africa are already experiencing acute drought, and one of the worst affected countries right now is Madagascar, where the rains have failed for years. Our correspondent Adrian Krish visited the Abovombe region.
Masi Vuatsara used to be a farmer. Now all she is able to harvest are cactus leaves. A relentless drought has left large parts of southern Madagascar dry and unproductive. And it has left people like Masi in a precarious situation. She now relies on turning cactus leaves into cattle feed to survive. Since the rains stopped, her life has been turned on its head.
We left the village because of the drought. It's very difficult to find water there. There was no harvest, so we had to sell all our belongings.
Many others are suffering the same fate as Masi. She lives alongside them in this informal camp in the town of Ambovombe. Trader Damiheri Salal opened the camp when he saw how many people had nowhere to go after being forced to leave their villages.
This old man lying here, he used to have 120 head of cattle. He was a rich man. But over the years, he had to sell everything he owned. And when the people have nothing to eat, they end up just lying here like this.
Here in the region, they call it kere, the hunger. People got used to not having enough food, going to bed hungry. It is incredible how they managed to adapt to this hostile environment, but of course, it comes at a price.
Magnirisoa Willi is in charge of the malnutrition unit for children at the hospital in Ambovombe. She says many children here are chronically ill. Last month, 2 children came too late and died. This little girl is one of the 5 she is currently treating.
This baby is 17 months old. Her arm circumference is very low. It's in the red part. 98 millimeters. Normally, it should be 130 for her age. She still can't stand. Normally, at this age, children already run. She can't even stand up. We don't have good food at home. Sometimes we mix the nutrition aid that NGOs give us with cassava. And we cook the cassava with a lot of water. If I have some money, I buy sweet potatoes.
Back at the camp, Damiheri Salal says he tries to help here and there by buying medicine and collecting donations. He believes mainly climate change is to blame for the situation, but he also says corruption by NGO staff and government incompetence are making matters worse. For decades, the government failed to invest in the region. The cycle of poverty gets worse as rainfall gets less.
It is definitely going to be very difficult to stop this crisis unless the aid organizations clean up their act. And it will also be difficult if the government doesn't see what's really happening on the ground to take the right measures. We need a hands-on approach to bring this situation to an end.
As she prepares the first and only meal of the day for her family, Masi Vuatsara asks herself why this is happening.
I don't know why the rain doesn't fall. It may be because of us humans. We don't love each other. Maybe that's why the rain has stopped falling. Or because strangers did something to prevent the rain. I don't know.
Some greens and 2 cups of rice. That's all the family of 14 can afford for today. Yet they still offer their neighbors to join, trying to help.
So we've heard from some people in Madagascar forced from their villages by the drought, but it's not just Madagascar. And to talk more about this, I am joined by Mohamed Abdika. He is Director for East Africa and the Horn of Africa at the UN's International Organization for Migration. It's good to have you on the program. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Abdika. Let's begin by talking about the migration in Africa that is being caused by climate change. Just what is the scale of this challenge?
Thank you for having me here today. First, we need to talk about climate change. We can no longer ignore the issue of displacement, mobility, and migration. And we never used to talk about that. And right now, we're bringing that issue of mobility in migration that is becoming key for us. A good example is in Somalia, where today we have over 1.3 million people displaced because of slow-induced climate migration, 1.3 million people. At the same time, you have close to 7.8 million people in need of food assistance. And if we don't act very quickly, we have over 280,000 people who are in acute food insecurity, who might die because of lack of food. That just gives you an example of the scale in Somalia. But if you look at the region itself, we have over 36.1 million people in need of assistance because of slow onset climate emergency that we're dealing with today.
Wow, I mean, these numbers are astonishing. And you talked about action, and I want to get to that point in a short moment, but let's talk about the patterns if we can. When people do move, how do they move and where are they likely to go?
I think right now what's happening, we see a lot of rural-urban migration. I can use Somalia as a case study, where we're seeing a large number of Somalis moving away from rural areas to the capital city or to the cities within the country itself. If you talk about Baidoa, the southwest state, you have hundreds of thousands of Somalis who've also run away from Al-Shabaab-held areas. It's an extremist group. They've run from there, now they're going to Baidoa looking for assistance. And we have over 10,000, for example, arrived last week alone. 10,000 people asking for assistance, where the UN and the humanitarian partners are providing food, shelter, health, non-food items for them to be able to deal with this. But that is just in Somalia. You have some of them in Burundi. You have the rising waters of Lake Tanganyika, which is displacing hundreds of Burundians themselves. You go to South Sudan, there's a whole city called Bentu underwater the last 7 months because of climate change.
Mr. Abdika, here in Europe, the focus is on the migrants who take the route of crossing the Mediterranean. Many have died doing so. But in Eastern Africa, where you work, there are also dangerous routes that people are taking. Can you tell us more about that?
The biggest route, the biggest maritime route in the world is called the Eastern route. The biggest maritime route in the world. Everybody talks about Libya, Mediterranean to Europe.
That's right.
Everybody talks about Mexico-US border. But when you talk about the Eastern route, you talk about the largest maritime migration route in the world. From the Horn of Africa, through Somalia, Djibouti, the Red Sea, to Yemen, which is a country in conflict, to Saudi Arabia. Oh. Every year we have close to 150,000 people who cross through these countries in deserts, being smuggled and trafficked, going into Yemen, a conflict zone, and going into Saudi Arabia. At the same time, we have Saudi Arabia deporting a large number of these migrants back to home countries. A good example is in Ethiopia. They've deported the last 7 months 103,000 Ethiopians back to Ethiopia itself.
A lot of those people on the move would classify as being climate change refugees, people who've been displaced because of climate change. Generally, is this issue being given enough attention? That is the international community committing enough money to helping people in this desperate position? You've told us some really astonishing numbers.
What we've come up with, what we call the Migrant Response Plan for Horn of Africa and Yemen. It's appealing for about close to $100 million to support these migrants in Djibouti, in Yemen, in Somalia, and in Ethiopia itself. We're getting some support, not as much as we wanted to get, but it's not as much support as we would like to see. And we always appeal to our development partners and donors to increase that support. We've seen the smuggling, the trafficking. We've seen the economic impact this has on these migrants. And we're seeing a very different trend, which is the feminization of migration. Before, it used to be men on the move trying to feed their families, but now we're seeing more and more women and girls on the move as well. And that is what is worrying us more because of the trafficking, the abuse, the gender-based violence they go through on the en route to their migration routes, trying to reach mostly Saudi Arabia. That's where they want to go. That's where we have the domestic workers. These are irregular migrants themselves. And that has an impact. But also, it's not just climate-induced migration. What we have is very much an economic reason. We ask them all the time, why are you on the move? And all of them tell us, I have no job. It's poverty, it's lack of economic opportunities in the region, and people are on the move.
Well, Mr. Abdika, we could really go on for a lot longer, but I think we can leave it here right now. That is Mohammed Abdika from the International Organization of Migration. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.